we showcased last time in the Exopolitical Pulse. So I just wanted to make mention of that. If any of you guys heard this story about the Japanese Prime Minister's wife being abducted by aliens and being taken to Venus, please email us at unifiedfieldradio@gmail.com. This is amazing. All of these like high-ranking political officials from all over the globe are coming out and making their statements and cases about aliens and alien abductions of themselves or sightings. Don't you think that's a little bit curious, Jordan?
I'm just reading on in the article here about the president who claims he was taken on a trip across the universe by aliens while on a business trip to Moscow.
If you haven't figured it out by now, Jordan's on the program purely for entertainment value.
What?
She obviously, she's here to break things up a bit, and I appreciate that. So it's nice to have another voice in the booth. So
also, for all you listeners, the main attraction of this magazine I'm reading from, the monthly headline is about Viking serpents, the mystery dragons of Sweden, from Norse sagas to modern sightings.
Awesome.
Wow.
Okay, well, anyway, we're running short on time. That's all the time we have today for you, Miss Jordan. But thanks for popping in quickly for some comic relief.
Thanks for having me, Mr. Brown. Always a pleasure.
All right, good night. So that was Miss Jordan, everybody. Do you remember her now? If you don't, it was episode 2. Look it up in the archives. It's on YouTube. I believe it should be there anyway. If not, it was probably taken away for reasons you could probably figure out. No slight to anyone, present company included. Anyway, in all seriousness, that is an interesting story. That last one I just mentioned there. It was talking about Mr. Ilum. I can never pronounce this guy's name. Ilyumzhinov. He wasn't actually the president of Moscow. He was a high-ranking official in one of the districts of Russia. But the Japanese prime minister's wife being abducted and taken to Venus, that's a pretty serious accusation, to follow on the line of Miss Jordan here. If you're Larry David fans, check it out. That is a serious thing. So I'd like to hear more about that story. I'll have to look more into that. Send me an email if you know anything more about that, for sure. Let's move on a bit here. I want to talk about Gary McKinnon. Sorry for the delay there. I'm just flipping through 14 Times August edition. I've been reading a lot of magazines lately. They're fantastic. It's a whole. I've been so digitally subscribed for so long that it's nice to actually get some paperwork here in my hands. So I'm really enjoying that. Everybody knows who Gary McKinnon is, I think, who's listening to the program. If you don't, he is a Brit who hacked into government files in the Pentagon around 2002, 2003. Maybe it's 2001, 2002. I'll read that here in a second with you. But he got into NASA computers and 97 Pentagon computers looking for UFO evidence and free energy evidence online. And he's on trial. He's been on trial for months and months, and they want to put him away for something like 50 years. What he knows, who knows? And if it's true, who knows? But the United States of America are seriously trying to persecute this guy, or prosecute him, rather. So anyway, here it is, 14 Times August edition, an end in sight for hackers' ordeal. Studying in the world of politics, the election of a coalition government has brought new hope for the family of hacker Gary McKinnon, whose ordeal we have followed in this column. New Conservative Home Security Theresa May has agreed to an adjournment of a hearing at the High Court that could have led to the immediate extradition of McKinnon, who has Asperger's syndrome. Labor politicians had signed up to a one-sided agreement with the U.S. government, which left former Home Secretary Alan Johnston little option but to agree to the extradition of the 44-year-old who has admitted hacking into 97 Pentagon and NASA computers from 2001 to 2002 while searching for evidence of UFOs and free energy. McKinnon could face a 60-year sentence if convicted over what many of his supporters feel was a crime motivated not by malice but obsessive curiosity. But the U.S. government sees things differently and claim that his meddling, conducted from a North London flat, breached the country's defense systems in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. During the election campaign, both David Cameron and Nick Clegg criticized the Labour government's handling of the long-running saga. Now is their opportunity to demonstrate that actions speak louder than words and bring McKinnon's long wait for closure to an end. So there's some interesting Gary McKinnon news for you out there in Radioland. Isn't that something else? I want to read a close encounter story here I thought was fascinating. Move on to this ancient crop circle story because we're running out of time, and get to Michael's letter outside of the exopolitical pulse. I'm not quite sure I'll be able to get to my sci-tech story, which is an older story about President Obama and asteroids. If you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe we'll have time to get to it. If not, I'll do it on the next show for sure. On February 21st, let me just tell you, this is from the UFO Casebook segment of 14 Times, written by Jenny Randalls. She's a fantastic writer. If you haven't read any of her stuff, she's got books out there as well in bookstores all over the world. Close encounter. On February 21st, as I began collating reports of the blue glow, things took an even stranger turn further south, where three youths had attended a school reunion in Buckinghamshire and were driving home through the village of Leckhampstead. Alan, quote-unquote, in the back seat of the car, was listening to music on his Walkman when he shouted that there was a strange glow ahead of them to the east. Brian, quote-unquote, driving woke Chris, quote-unquote, dozing in the front passenger seat. They saw a large cigar-shaped glowing object brightly with thousands of lights, quote, radiating from all angles, end quote. Alan slowed the car so they could watch closely, and they could see that the UFO was just over a wood just ahead before it suddenly accelerated away at immense speed to the south. Brian saw that the object was now apparently hovering over the village of Maids Morton. They arrived there just before 1 a.m. The object was huge and tilted at a steep angle, moving from house to house above the darkened village. Parking in a small field, Brian and Chris went on foot for a closer look, leaving a terrified Alan in the back seat. But they soon returned to their vehicle when the thing began to move closer, emitting a mass of powerful lights. Now keen to get away, they repeatedly turned the ignition, but the car was completely dead. Then a massive beam of light emerged from the UFO and completely enveloped the vehicle as the air was filled with a faint humming sound. Half blinded, Brian was frantically trying to find the steering wheel. Chris tried to open the door and flee, but it was stuck firm as if welded. Alan had thrown himself flat on the back seat, burying his head in his hands. Suddenly, Brian's fingers found the ignition, and this time it worked. They shot out of the field, headed at speed in the opposite direction to the way home, heading for the perceived safety of Buckingham with its bright lights. After driving around for some time, they stopped outside a police station and debated making a report. Instead, they finally headed home. It was now after 4 a.m., 3 hours after their close encounter, implying a period of time missing from their recall, although they might simply have lost track in their panic. The two youths who were wearing watches discovered that both had stopped just after 1:10 a.m., when the light beam had struck. Was this case connected with the mass sighting in and around Manchester Airport the night before? We may never know, but something strange was in the sky during those hours, and reports now released from the MOD archives barely scratch the surface of this fascinating encounter. There are hundreds of sightings in every batch of files being released into the National Archives through David Clarke's efforts. Only rarely do we know more about them than what is contained in a few terse paragraphs of texts. How many might hide a case as intriguing as this one? Now, we all know out there in Radioland, especially if we're into the UFO phenomenon, that the MOD in Britain had released a tremendous amount of files, claiming that they were done, they were washing their hands of the UFO scenario and releasing all known files on that. But even Nick Pope, who worked for the British Central Intelligence Agency for a number of years, admits that government agencies generally tend to say these things when they want the public to disappear and get off their back looking for information. We all know, including Nick Pope, that that's not really the case. When something like this happens, it generally means that they're still interested. They just want the public off their back, and they will continue to investigate. After all, if there are craft or entities in our airspace and we can't control that airspace, that is a serious breach of national security, and that should be important. It should be important. Because if they can't control the skies, they can't keep their people safe. Am I right? Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that's how I feel about the MOD, and if you look closely, that's exactly what the situation is. Anyway, moving on, I want to read this old encounter of crop circles that was published in 1890, I believe. You guys should really pick up a copy of 14 Times. I don't generally subscribe to the magazine because I'm more exopolitical based. I like to get the hard ufology news, UFO magazine, Open Minds magazine, that sort of thing. But it's fun to pick up 14 Times because you get a plethora of stuff, a veritable fountain of vast and diverse stories, from sightings of green men in woods off of trains in Britain to Viking sea serpents, as Miss Jordan mentioned earlier, because it is basically a British-based magazine. There's an interesting article on Carl Jung in here, of course, Jung being an amazing intellect and doctor, who gave way to the idea of collective consciousness and alluded to the idea of an Akashic record. In the article in this, which is really well researched and written, it talks about his forays into mysticism and the occult and how that kind of permeated throughout his life and his family's life. Really interesting read. Check it out. All right, I want to get to this story on crop circles. Of course, there are stories that are a lot older than this. I mean, the most famous one being the woodcut from, I think, the 17th century of the devil mowing the crops with his little scythe there. But this one comes from a local newspaper from 1890 in October. Looks like the newspaper's from America in Tennessee. It goes something like this. The people in the eastern portion of Claiborne County, Tennessee, are excited over a remarkable occurrence which took place there not long ago. It is one of the most marvelous occurrences ever heard of, and it will prove to be a problem over which scientific minds may wrestle for some time to come. Edgar Ramsey is a farmer who lives 5 miles or 8 kilometers from Lick Skillet. He arrived in Middlesbrough recently. The story he told would not find believers at first, but since then it has been proven that he has told nothing but the truth. His statement is thus reported by a correspondent of the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Quote, "Last Sunday afternoon I noticed what appeared to be a large green-looking cloud coming from a westerly direction towards my house. It was a long distance off, and the rain was falling heavily. Shortly afterward it became very cold, in fact, so cold that I went indoors, lit a big fire, and put on a big heavy coat. When I came out again, the big green cloud was almost over the house, and the air was as cold as on a winter day. The wind howled, and hail fell in stones as big as eggs. All this lasted 20 minutes, and then the sky cleared up, and I felt more like myself again." Quote, "An hour after, I was sitting with my wife near the fire when I heard a horse galloping at full speed, and when I went out to see who was there stood Jake Warren, a neighbor farmer who lives about 1.25 miles or 2 clicks from me. He was pale as a ghost and was trembling all over. It took him over 10 minutes to commence to tell me what he had to say, and as he was talking, I thought he was crazy. Quote, he stated that a big green cloud came over his place, and that something which looked like balls of fire had fallen all around his house. He had 5 acres, 2 hectares of corn growing in a field next to the house. After the storm had cleared away, he went to see what damage had been done. He saw that some corn had been blown down, and entering the field, he found every stalk turned to stone. Every stalk turned to stone. There were 2 fine hogs in the field, and they, too, were petrified and standing there as if cut out of solid rock. Myself and wife thought the man was raving mad, but induced him to remain over till morning, when we promised to visit his place with him. That we did, and what we saw will be remembered so long as we both live. There was the corn blown down, but every stalk of it was petrified. It was not as hard as granite, but it appeared to be more like soft stone. I took my knife and cut it, and it became powder.